on those issues, on what they think has defined the last 12 months, and we'll react to one another, and then we'll open the conversation to you all, so that you can offer either a reaction to what you've heard, or maybe bring a trend or a perspective that has not been covered by the panelists. We have a new person with us who has been very, very kind and has agreed to join the panel. So Nani could not make it. Unfortunately, she's sick, poor thing. But Rebecca McKinnon has kindly offered to join the panel, and I've asked Rebecca because Nani was going to offer a perspective on the online freedom of expression, and I thought this is quite essential to what we're talking about. So, in a new order of speaker, I'm going to begin, if it's okay with you, Toby. You're going to just give us, so Toby is the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Democracy. He's been doing that since 2010. He's an old colleague, not old in the sense of old, but he and I have been colleagues for many years at Article 19, and he's a very well-known, very respected expert on freedom of expression. So, Toby, what's the trend? What's defining free speech?
You know, fortunately, I'm getting to the point where I'm not that insulted anymore by being called old, so it's all right. Yes, so you as you introduced it, said what has defined free speech in the last year or 2 years, and I probably didn't read my instructions properly, so I'm not actually going to talk about what I think defined free speech, but rather about something where I thought was a rather interesting development. So it's not doesn't reach the importance of definitional, but I think it's quite an interesting development in an important area. And the area is on safety, so very different from anything we've discussed so far. Safety in the sense of attacks on freedom of expression, especially physical attacks. This is an issue which the world has been grappling with for, a long time, and an issue which doesn't really seem to have experienced much success at all. The number of journalists killed, according to established ratings, it goes up and down a bit year by year, but it hasn't, gone down in any structural sense over the last 10, 15 years. The level of impunity for the people who commit those crimes hasn't also gone down, goes up and down a little tiny bit. Actually, that one doesn't move very much. So we have this problem. In 2012, the United Nations adopted a plan of action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. And one of the tools for combating or for increasing safety in that plan of action was the idea of national safety mechanisms. So specialized arrangements dedicated to combating, both to providing protection and to combating impunity, because there are these two sides of, under the sort of the safety umbrella, those are the two main elements. And at that time, there were probably only two countries that really had a national mechanism, Mexico and Colombia. And the reviews of those two and a couple of other sort of more limited mechanisms were, I would say, largely negative. The Mexican side, almost entirely, slightly more positive reviews of the Colombian one, but not so much so. Okay, that was 2012. Since then, almost no, we got, 200 countries in the world, 40 or 50 have serious safety issues, almost no developments in this area despite that. So it's sort of a frozen area, and over the last few years, we've started to see a few developments, and I think, they're interesting, first of all, because I think we're starting to see movement in this space, firstly, and secondly, because the types of mechanisms are looking very, very different, and I think much more integrated in the sense sense that they deal with both protection and impunity, and integrated in the sense that they build in civil society and multi-stakeholder participation much more, solidly into them. And I will talk very briefly about two of those that I've been personally involved with. Neither of them has yet come completely to fruition, so they don't actually exist as mechanisms yet, but they're sort of on the way. The first is in Nepal, and there the mechanism will be, I hope, optimistically speaking, based in the National Human Rights Commission. The National Human Rights Commission of Nepal has an amazing mandate. It has the power to go out and directly investigate crimes that breach human rights. It can require the Attorney General to bring a case. So when it recommends that a case be brought, the Attorney General, the courts of Nepal have said that the Attorney General has to bring the case. So then the mechanism there basically has a bunch of different levels. It has a steering committee with the Attorney General, the police, the Ministry of Justice, or the police, the Ministry of the Interior, the police, and several civil society organizations, and of course the National Human Rights Commission. Beneath that, a working level, again, with civil society hardwired, and the working level group will, where an allegation comes up, action, the network of primary investigation and protection providing mechanisms. So really a radically new model working on both sides where civil society is completely integrated from the top to the bottom. The second mechanism where I've been working is in Iraq. And Iraq, if those of you who follow this issue will know, it sort of tops the charts. On both, well, I don't know if it tops the charts on impunity, very high levels of impunity, but certainly tops the charts on killings of journalists. And just over the last few months, they are also talking about putting in place a mechanism, again, a sort of an oversight committee where civil society is hardwired into it. It involves all of the key players, including in this case the judiciary, which I think is a very important partner to have inside of a mechanism, not inside of the Nepal mechanism. So I think it's really interesting that after years and years of sort of lip service to this idea, finally now we're seeing at least some ideas, although they haven't yet, as I said, been in place, but at least some concrete plans. And what's really interesting, they're sort of multi in the sort of both sides of the equation and multi-stakeholder in the proper sense, civil society properly integrated. So I think it'd be really interesting if these things actually get put in place and where they go.
Thank you very much, Toby. And it's nice to begin with a rather positive milestone, or about to be a milestone. Rebecca, can I ask you, what do you think has been a key development or a key defining moment for freedom of expression over the last period?
Yeah. Well, again, I apologize for not being Nani, because Nani would have shown up very well prepared to this panel, and I didn't have enough time even to ask her for all her notes. But she would have kind of chapter and verse on many cases around the world that are being fought right now. Overall, I think the attack on online civil society is growing worse. The Committee to Protect Journalists, on whose board I sit, tracks jailed journalists in addition to journalists who've been killed and other things. And the largest group of jailed journalists are online, are those reporting online, they define doing journalism online pretty broadly. In part, it's because, of course, governments kind of see how effective civil society has been using, effectively civil society and independent journalists have been in using the internet. But I guess to come down to sort of the defining issue around freedom of expression and the internet in the past 12 months, it's really Brexit and the US election, and the election of the current occupant of the White House. So that's the only title I'm going to confer upon that person. you know, and I think a little bit of a moral panic on the part of democracies, or at least in part of a segment of people in democracies who define themselves as not populist, about the way in which platforms are being manipulated for disinformation campaigns. I don't like the term fake news. But for information warfare and disinformation campaigns, and I think the kind of concern, the rising concern about, you know, not only is there an issue with censorship, but there's an issue of kind of the flooding of the discourse space with disinformation, with hate speech, with other things that drowns out other types of speech, you know, and so it's kind of a battle of the volume of different kinds of speech, which then certain types of speech are either drowning out or silencing the right of certain types of speakers, and so how do you deal with that, right? And how you deal with the centralization of information platforms, which, you know, whose rules or mechanisms then can be gamed by certain actors more than others, that certain voices kind of are in a better position to take advantage of those platforms than others, and what you do about it. And, you know, on the moral panic side, there's been sort of and we'll talk more about this in the next panel, but sort of a jump to regulation on the part of some governments that has been quite unhelpful. You see in Global Voices, among other organizations, have been tracking kind of the proliferation of anti-fake news laws around the world. And, you know, you have the NetzDG, which isn't officially an anti-fake news law in Germany, but, you know, there's that kind of aspect of it. But you see a number of countries from Malaysia to, you know, a whole range, Russia, you know, a whole range of different countries enacting laws around disinformation. China has had a law against spreading rumors for a long time, under which somebody was jailed quite recently who was reporting on corruption. So yeah, I think the defining moment is we're realizing that kind of freedom of speech and how you actually govern speech in a manner that enables the freedom and rights for all voices, not just the strongest and the most well-financed, but also how do we avoid the moral panic that will just make things worse?
Thank you. In fact, maybe to follow up on what you've just presented, I think it will make sense maybe for Andrey to tell us, because you wanted to highlight disinformation in the region that you cover. So your 5 minutes, okay. Lightning moment.
Thank you, Agnès. Yes, indeed, I will. I'll make a very short presentation about the disinformation regulation, because I believe it's a new, but in a way, a new old restriction on freedom of the media and freedom of speech in the region of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which includes both Northern America, Europe, and former Central Asia and Mongolia. What I will say is based on the discussion paper or discussion book which I just prepared for the OSCE. Currently it exists only in one copy. But if you will be interested, I will be happy to send you a link once it is published in the coming weeks. And the topic of disinformation is definitely back in the agenda because of propaganda, and I think that the European Parliament resolution of 2016 defines very well the disinformation as a tool of propaganda and the concerns related to the propaganda threats to Europe of this propaganda. Laws on disinformation, as I said, in quite a number of cases are old, and they are in the books for decades, and in at least one case for more than a century. And I'm not talking about the laws that relate to false information in the context of defamation or context of fraud or misleading advertising, for example. They are in the laws in the criminal codes of a number of countries of the OSCE. They are in the laws on the media and press, and at least in one case, this information is plainly prohibited in the constitution. That is the Constitution of Lithuania, which says freedom to impart information shall be incompatible with disinformation. The criminal codes of a number of countries, including Cyprus, including Kazakhstan, including Russia, and until 2013, Croatia, and also Canadian criminal code until 1992, and very often referred to in many articles, this provision of Canadian criminal code which prohibits this information irrespective of defamation or any other crime. There are a number of press and broadcasting laws, and I should start with France in its famous freedom of the press law of 1881. There has been a provision that bans straightforwardly disinformation, and that today serves as a basis for the widely debated new French bill that will target specifically disinformation. But not only that, the public information law in Lithuania encourages the independent media regulator to take action to stop disinformation in broadcasting. In Russia, there are at least two very recent laws, one of 2014, which prohibits false presentation of the activity of the USSR during World War II, and this criminal prohibition is very actively used. And another one from 2016, which prescribes all news aggregators. I mean, there are certain conditions, but basically prescribes all news aggregators to disseminate only news which are reliable and truthful. There is also law in Slovakia, broadcasting law in Slovakia, which demands only objective and impartial news and current affairs broadcast on TV and radio. There is Ofcom broadcasting code, which speaks about fair presentation of facts and news. That's slightly different from country to country, and also in the way that these information laws are implemented. But definitely, they do exist in those countries. And aside from those, there is, of course, a quite significant body of election law which discourages or forbids disinformation during the election campaigns. What I wanted to say, rather than give you a background of such diverse and historically important disinformation laws, is to provide with my views about the recent trends related to disinformation and the way disinformation is starting to be regulated in the region. The first one is that there is definitely an increased interest of the states in regulating disinformation, first of all, as a threat to state or public interest, as interest to protect national security and public order. That is increasingly used by quite a number of national authorities. Second one, it will be the special focus of such threats during the election period, and for example, the law which has been developed in France will focus particularly on the election periods as a periods when the national security and public interest are threatened most of all. The third trend, which I see is quite interesting, is that the concept of national security is being expanded to include the vague notions of informational security, understood differently from this country in many European countries, as well as cultural security. And both informational security and cultural security allow countries to impose, some countries, to impose straightforward sanctions against information, any information, which comes from a particular source of such information, from a country which potentially disseminates this information. And the fourth trend, which I think is also quite important, is an increased use of national regulators. And I mean, theoretically, all of them are supposed to be independent, but we know in practice they're not. Increased use of national regulators to sanction anyone disseminating disinformation, both in broadcasting, but also increasingly more in social media and online in general. Those four trends, I mean, I will not judge on them. I'll let you judge on them. They, of course, depend from country to country, and the situation in different countries are different. But I see them as quite important trends to monitor whether they will become really stable and effective in Europe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrey, for this overview of recent trends. Can I turn to Jameel? Jameel, what do you think are, how is freedom of expression defined, developed? Well, what's your take on our period?
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you. First, thanks for including me in the conference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the United States, also without mentioning who. I'm probably going to say some of the same things that Rebecca said, but less eloquently. I think that one of the most significant developments over the last year here in the U.S. has been the deepening and complicating of the debate about free speech on social media. And I would point first to the Supreme Court's decision in a case called Packingham versus North Carolina, which was decided last summer. And it was a case in which the court struck down, under the First Amendment, a law that banned registered sex offenders from accessing the internet. And the fact that the law was struck down was probably not that surprising, but the language in the court's decision was very broad, very positive about the democratic force that the internet now has in our society, very positive about the democratic potential of social media, recognizing that the most important space right now for the exchange of ideas is cyberspace, that ordinary people engage in all sorts of constitutionally protected activity on social media, and recognizing that social media is now the way that many public officials communicate with their constituents. So it's a recognition at the highest level that of the connection between social media and the First Amendment. Now, since then, we've also seen a recognition of the pathologies engendered by social media, and some of these have already been mentioned. Some of them stem from the actions of users on social media, so abuse or harassment or machine-amplified propaganda and disinformation. All of that stems from the actions of third parties on using social media. But then some of the pathologies stem from the practices of the social media companies themselves, pervasive surveillance, filter bubbles, seemingly arbitrary censorship, which is paired with a seeming indifference on the part of the platforms to addressing abuse and manipulation by some of their users. And I think that Mark Zuckerberg's testimony just a couple of weeks ago before Congress, it was unsatisfying in many different ways, but the fact of the testimony was, I think, an indication of the public's growing recognition of the power of the social media platforms and the implications of that power. So I think that debate is only going to continue over the next year. It's probably going to center around Among other questions, the question of to what extent platforms should be responsible for the content posted by their users. As most of you probably know, there is a statute in the United States that gives very broad immunity to the platforms for content posted by their users. That statute was certainly necessary to the development, to the emergence of the social media platforms as we know them today. Many people think that that immunity is too broad, and that the breadth of the immunity has many costs, including free speech costs, that the immunity disincentivizes the platforms from addressing abuse and harassment. And because they don't address abuse and harassment, many voices, marginal voices, are driven away from the platforms. They become disengaged from the public square. And so, a number of different scholars have and advocacy groups have proposed narrowing the immunity. And there will be, it has been narrowed over the last couple months through regulation, but it may be narrowed further over the next year. So that's one question, and the other question I wanted to mention is to what extent is moderation of content by the platforms something that we should be worried about or celebrate? What should our attitude be towards content moderation on the part of the platforms? And that's actually, I think, a complicated question because the platforms can be conceived of in different ways. You can think of the platforms as speakers or editors, and they are sometimes speakers or editors or curators of expressive communities. But sometimes it's less useful or less accurate to think of them in that way, and instead we ought to think of them as facilitators of other people's speech. And if you think of them as facilitators of other people's speech, then maybe your attitude towards moderation or even censorship on the platforms ought to be different. And sometimes we should think of the platforms not as speakers or editors or publishers and not solely as facilitators of other people's speech, but rather as part of the infrastructure of democracy. And if you think of them as part of the infrastructure of democracy, again, your attitude towards moderation of speech or censorship of speech on the platforms might be different. And certainly your attitude towards the constitutionality of regulation governing the actions of the platforms might change depending on how you conceive of them. I think I'll leave it there because Agnès is about to interrupt me.
Thank you. My body language. Thanks a lot, Jameel, for this this intervention. Can I ask Vidushi? I know you're going to present a different standpoint, and very
Vidushi.
much.
Good afternoon. My name is Vidushi. I'm with Article 19. I'm going to be talking about the impact of artificial intelligence on freedom of expression. So while it's tempting to think of killer robots and a robot doing a lawyer's job, for example, as an organization we focused very specifically on short to medium term impacts on freedom of expression. And what I mean by that is that we're not looking at whether robots should be given legal rights, but we're actually looking at how do machine learning systems that actually run our everyday lives have an impact on freedom of expression. And to discuss this, I think the most interesting trend really has been how we're developing ethical guidelines and regulation, and how companies and governments and individuals are approaching this idea. So I think usually when you think of governments, at least I think of regulation. I just assume that governments will want to regulate. What's strange with artificial intelligence is that most governments are shying away from regulation. They're coming up with ethical task forces, and they're coming up with guidelines, and they're coming up with conferences and centers of excellence in AI ethics, but nobody is really talking about regulation. And I think not nobody. I think the European Union is thinking about regulation, the UK is considering regulation, but a large majority of governments are explicitly moving towards ethical guidelines. And I think to understand this, we need to consider each government's risk appetite, right? So for example, I come from India. India's government recently came out with a task force on AI. And the task force, speaks about national security and how AI can inform national security, and how it can inform consumer behavior, and how it can inform employment, and the list goes on. The only place where they have discussed freedom of expression and privacy concerns is in the retail sector. So not national security. AI is great for national security. There's no human rights consideration there. But in the retail sector is where we really have to think about freedom of expression. Right? And then you move over to the UK, and the House of Lords recently published a report on how they think AI regulation should take place. And they are pushing towards understanding algorithmic bias and understanding what impact AI can have on privacy and freedom of expression. And when I said risk appetite a few minutes ago, what I meant is that there's this false dichotomy between innovation and regulation. So whereas in India we're trying to tap this economic potential and we think that that AI will transform our economies, in the UK there's a more sort of deliberate approach of maybe we need to think about bias in the first place. So that's the first piece when it comes to governments. When it comes to companies, what we're seeing is, predictably, that companies push for self-regulation. So in Mark Zuckerberg's testimony 2 weeks ago, I think he used the word AI tools 33 times. I only counted once, but I'm sure it was at least 33 times. And while it's tempting to think of AI as kind of this panacea for ensuring that freedom of expression standards are respected, you have to think about what standards will those AI tools be adhering to. At one point he was asked, so like, how do you bring down content? What is content that you should bring down? What content should AI tools flag off automatically? And I think the answer was anything that makes people uncomfortable. And that is not in compliance with any law, to the best of my understanding, right? So in terms of having clarity of what is the mechanism and what is the standard this mechanism will adhere to, there's definitely a long way to go, and there's definitely a lot to think about in terms of how does human rights play into this. So at Article 19, what we've been doing is we've been trying to understand to what extent human rights frameworks and human rights law can actually inform ongoing discourse, whether it's fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, right? Can human rights standards be the minimum requirement on which you build all of these technical standards? When you think about things like regulating credit scoring, say not in the US, because I know it's well regulated here, but in countries that don't have a regulation, how do you think about fairness? How do you think about equality? What we're finding is that human rights are the only framework that have shared understanding internationally, and they have enforcement mechanisms which ethical guidelines don't have. And that's really been a challenge to talk about, okay, ethical guidelines are great, they let us evaluate whether we are on the good side or the bad side. Fairness, accountability, transparency in machine learning is an excellent field of research. It's very interesting. They're doing a lot of amazing work, but it's evaluative. It is not an enforcement mechanism. And so I think in terms of freedom of expression, what the challenge really is, and the trend is to move away from standards that we know and understand, and how do we bring back human rights language into a discussion that is almost predicated on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last speaker is Edison Lanza, and I guess we're going to have a Latin American perspective on that question.
Thank you, Agnès, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to share some advances in terms of jurisprudence in the Latin American system. I share the preoccupation and the concerns about the paneling in the different issues like safety, internet, and digital area. But I prepared some, highlights about the last 2 years in the terms of the Inter-American human rights system. As you know, the Inter-American human rights system has two bodies, the Inter-American Commission and Inter-American Court, and all the cases go into the system through the Inter-American Commission. The Inter-American Commission finally have a decision, and if the states don't comply with this, set to and go in present to the court. And some of these cases are in the different steps of the systems. In the last 2 years, the decision of the Commission and the court have recognized For example, the extension of the content of freedom of expression for judges, the content of the right of the women to access relevant information in order to exercise the sexual and reproductive rights, the right of the union leaders and labor's representatives to express their opinion or ideas regarding labor conflict, the right of individuals to participate in the public debate and criticize the government and the public officials without the fear of criminal proceedings, and the right to journalists to carry out their profession in safe condition. This is the main cases, the main issues that the cases, aboard. But let me comment some cases that I think that is very important for the jurisprudence and the standards for the Latin American countries, and think it's important to share with the globally. In regard of safety on journalists, the Commission adopted 2 reports regarding the killing of journalists and the issue of impunity. That is a broad problem in Latin America, in which a decision establishes that those killings constitute a violation of the right to freedom of expression, and both cases were submitted to the Inter-American Court. The last March, the Inter-American Court announced that adopted rulings about those cases. Unfortunately, just we are waiting to the merit of the decision. One of this case is Nelson Carvajal regards Colombia, and the case to do with the killing of the journalists for reasons related to practice of journalism in silent zones of Colombia, with politics, corruption, and so on. And the development of this case is to go more deep in the obligation that has the state to diligently investigate crimes against journalists who cover news about corruption. Another case is Herzog versus Brazil. The case it's about the detention and torture and finally the death of the journalist Vladimir Herzog under the dictatorship in Brazil. And this case go around more of the impunity because the amnesty law in Brazil that impede to advance in the investigation and the sanction of the guilties of the. And finally, we want to highlight a very important case for the region about the information case against Bolivia. The court confirmed the findings of the Commission and determined that the rule informed consent in a medical proceeding is associated with the right of access information, and is, remark the instrumental and use the access information in regards with the protection and other human rights. And finally, I want to highlight 2 cases about criminalization of the expression by public interest. The Inter-American Commission adopted a merit report about a case in Venezuela, Rocío San Miguel and others versus Venezuela. This case is about the sanction of a public official because they signed a referendum against the former president Hugo Chavez, and he, have a retaliation decision of the fire then of the public service, and this case is also in the court, but the Commission found that the violation of access to information in an indirect manner.
Thank you, Edison. Thank you. So we have a very broad perspective on the development and the perspective. 2 rather positive ones from, well, it's not the only definition that you want to offer, but both Toby and Edison have pointed to the fact that at national level there are steps taken to protect journalists, And at the regional level, the Inter-American Court and commissions have been protecting freedom of expression in a more forceful fashion. And then we have the other speakers who are offering a rather pessimistic vision of the world we inhabit as far as freedom of expression is concerned, most of which is derived from the online world. There are some interesting concepts, I think, that we've heard, such as the notion of information security or cultural security, the question as to whether the new online infrastructures are to be seen as part of the institution of democracy rather than as corporate actors. And that has huge, of course, implications. The question of immunity, liability of intermediaries, and whether or not artificial intelligence should be regulated, and what will be the impact on innovation. So, a very big perspective. Before asking a few more questions, I wanted to see whether you had any reaction to one another. Yeah, Toby.
I just have a very small point really about the false news or disinformation, that the Canadian case is quite an interesting one, because we had a prohibition on false news, disseminating false news, and the Supreme Court fairly comprehensively struck it down. So if you're legally arguing against that, and interestingly, there have been some cases in Africa, a really remarkable case from the Supreme Court of Zimbabwe, also, sort of building on the Zundel case in Canada, we were talking about at lunch, and even going further than that. So I think that there's, at the judicial level, there is a body of work out there that highlights pretty clearly and well, the reasons why those kinds of general prohibitions, as opposed to inaccurate information related to, hate speech, to defamation, to whatever, could be prescribable.
So that point leads to the questions I had to all of you, or some of you, which was, how do you assess the role of the judicial sector in the development you have highlighted? Do you think that they have both the courts at all levels and indeed the legal profession in general, are they emerging from those fairly difficult times as a beacon of hope? Are they being buried as well into the wave of counter norms and so on? How do you assess the role of the judicial sector? So I have Jameel, everybody, okay. So let's begin with Jameel.
Okay, well, so I think in the United States, at least, this is, it's a hard question to answer, because in some ways, this is a great time for the First Amendment in American courts. American courts, I think First Amendment claims do better than almost any other constitutional claims in American courts, and the Supreme Court in particular is very sympathetic to First Amendment claims, so sympathetic that it often sees First Amendment claims even where the litigants haven't raised them. Now, whether that's a good thing or not, I think is complicated. The Supreme Court has a particular vision of the First Amendment, which privileges autonomy interests over self-government or truth-seeking. The Supreme Court, when I say the Supreme Court, I'm really talking about Justice Kennedy, who's on this set of issues and many other sets of issues, the most important justice for better and worse. But often the Supreme Court's vision of the First Amendment is one that privileges speakers over listeners, that thinks of speakers in isolation rather than as part of a system of free expression. And I think that explains the Supreme Court's attitude towards campaign finance regulations. Maybe it explains its attitude towards commercial speech as well. And one interesting thing about the social media questions is that you often have First Amendment claims on both sides, or at least free speech claims on both sides. You have the platforms that are characterizing themselves as speakers or editors or publishers entitled to the full protections of the First Amendment. And then on the other hand, you have the users who are also exercising free speech rights on these, on these platforms, and are invoking the same values, even if it's harder for them to invoke the First Amendment directly, but they're invoking the same values. And so you have free speech. You have to decide which free speech argument should prevail. And at the end of the day, free speech is going to win. Free speech is going to win, but it's going to be one version of free speech over another version, and I think that's not an unprecedented thing, but an unusual thing, and something that makes these issues, fascinating.
Okay. Yes, sorry, I have a blank. Andrey.
Thank you, Agnès. Well, I'd like to tell very shortly two stories. One is a bit grim, another is more bright, for a balance. The grim story is a story I'm following since 2014. And when I was writing the non-paper on propaganda and freedom of the media, and it relates to the situation in the Ukrainian courts. Right after the Maidan revolution, the national regulator demanded from the Ukrainian cable operators to stop rebroadcasting Russian channels. They appealed immediately in the courts, and it was an administrative case which by law should be settled within 30 days, and since April 2014, no decision was made. I mean, there were different stages. There were many decisions to postpone, to merge the cases into one, to order an expert review, to order another expert review. Then I thought finally, I was wrong, finally in the fall of 2016, the court, which had all the cases in one, had all the reviews, which were not made public, by the way, said, okay, now we see it's a national security matter. We should allow the special services and prosecution to make their opinion within 2 weeks. That was the last we heard about the case in autumn 2016. And in a way, the courts really waited for some sort of a new law, new decision that will allow them to get rid of the case. And that law was a law on sanctions, which basically said no Russian channels will be allowed in Ukraine. And in a way, this ended the case, although formally there is no decision. Another decision which was taken in Slovakia, there is a decision of the Constitutional Court. It was taken in the end of 2015, if I'm not wrong, 2014. And it relates to a very interesting case of a broadcaster which during the election campaign in Slovakia in 2010 fined one of the TV stations for broadcasting false news. And the false news was a statement by one politician in the news program about another politician saying that the other one has withdrawn from the list of the political party in Slovakia as a candidate for the parliamentary elections, which was false. It was one time, it was one program. I mean, of course, in Slovakia, there were many channels and many sources for information which disputed that, and anybody could find out that was not true. All the courts where the decision of the national regulator to fine the broadcaster were appealed, agreed with the national regulator, and confirmed the fine up to the Supreme Court. Then the Constitutional Court overturned the decision of the Supreme Court in a very long decision, which is also another bunch of papers, 48 pages, very detailed, very argumentative. And I would just read one very interesting, I think the most interesting part of it. it has certain conditions. I mean, it didn't make a decision whether it was constitutional or not to disseminate false news. Because the law in Slovakia says that the news should be objective, the news should be fair. That was apparently not the case when they were objective and fair. There was no argument given of the other side or anything like that. But it gave a very interesting conclusion. It said, in particular, the Constitutional Court states that the legal limitation of the freedom of the media to require objectively and impartially information in news programs and public affairs programs, and the related authority of the national regulator to impose sanctions for violation of this requirement is not possible to draw from the constitutional right of individuals to receive information, since the right to receive information includes the right to receive information both truthful, verifiable, and neutral, as well as fictitious, unreliable, untrue, or distorting truths or presenting a particular viewpoint. In addition, information that is fictitious, inaccurate, and untrue encourages the recipient, when confronted with the information on the same subject received from other sources, to engage in critical thinking and increases the will to seek and learn other views on the subject. This leads to self-realization of the person and encourages an ongoing social discourse on the subject. The Constitutional Court assesses this as a democratic element of a free society. So again, I mean, it gives many details about how to view the decision of the Constitutional Court, but in fact, it was later referred to in the Slovak judicial system as a decision to allow lies in broadcasting.
Okay, thanks, Andrey. Edison, are the courts a beacon of hope for freedom of expression in Latin America?
No, of course, it's a complex moment, and freedom of expression in Latin America is under pressure by the organized crime, the corruption and politics, by the authoritarianism government in many countries, like Venezuela, just Nicaragua. Yesterday have a protest and terrible use of the force against the people. But I think that in Latin America and in the Inter-American system, first time in many years is a big discussion about the way to strengthen democracy, the way to fight against corruption, and the way to fight against this problem, these big problems in the region. And in this picture, I think that I have the hope that the national courts and also the Inter-American, the Commission, the Inter-American Court play a very important role to strengthen this kind of standard that the special rapporteur have 20 years, and this is a cumulative works along the years. But I think that this is very important. We released the last year a report about the last 3 years of national jurisprudence in high courts like Mexico, like Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and they have a great, very important best practice in strength and democracy and diversity and pluralism and so on, and access information also. But obviously, in the middle of this, or other decision that we don't have the same vision, the best practice. But I think that something like that Guilherme said today, it's to strengthen the training with the judges in the region. They have a great interest in these issues. They have the open mind to discuss with the Inter-American international bodies and also the journalists and the platforms, and they, strengthen the capacity building to know these new challenges also. This is not magical. We need to work in different ways.
Thank you. Rebecca? You.
I have something from Nani,
Yeah.
actually, and Nani, I really thought it was important, especially with this question about courts and litigation, to bring up the work that Nani is doing with the Digital Freedom Fund, which is supporting strategic litigation around the world, and that's it's precisely because it is in the courts where, you know, there's a real hope to stop bad law, to reverse back, to push back against bad practice and bad law. And she actually sent me a list of a number of cases, and I won't read all the details here, but, you know, just last week in Ireland, the Court of Appeal agreed that the data of an anonymous blogger in Uganda could not be revealed, and of course, that link between privacy and freedom of expression with anonymous speech is really important. And so she's kind of is citing a list of cases, you know, from Ireland to the UK, to the United States, and elsewhere, Lithuania, where strategic litigation is resulting in court decisions that are what I think the panel would all agree on the right side of freedom of expression, and also around privacy. So one of the cases she didn't mention, but I think is probably fairly well known to some of the people in the room, is the Indian Supreme Court's decision last year that privacy is a human right, you know, is a civil right under the Indian Constitution, and that very much interrelates with freedom of expression in the Indian context. So I think that in many countries around the world, the courts are an important place for this fight, and it's, I think, organizations like Nani's that are kind of helping and supporting people doing strategic litigation around the world to compare notes, to be globally strategic about these cases is important.
Yeah, that's also certainly our finding at Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. You're reacting quickly, and then I'll open the floor to your reactions, to trends. Go ahead, Toby.
I actually have a comment to build on Jameel's comments, because I think he raises a really important point. What about a court case, a constitutional case, or an international human rights case where freedom of expression is pitted against freedom of expression? I think basically my observation has been that courts don't know how to deal with that, or they don't have a proper approach to dealing with that. If you look under international law, we have a guarantee of freedom of expression. States are allowed to restrict freedom of expression, but they have to, you know, jump through a lot of hoops to justify that restriction. So basically, you know, strong presumption in favor of free speech and, you know, limited right to restrict it. And that's absolutely proper, because, you know, freedom of expression is a human right, and we're restricting that human right. But when you have a case pitting free speech against free speech, or freedom of expression, you know, broader concept perhaps, that analysis doesn't work anymore. If we imagine that, you know, two freedom of expression arguments against each other, if the case is brought by the left hand, the right hand, left hand to you, you know, then the right hand have to justify the restriction, even though, and if the other one brought, so you could imagine the case where it was almost random, or where the case was tilted based on the established jurisprudence, and you see the courts doing that. There, you know, the European Court of Human Rights, for example, when it sees these two values pitted against each other, it walks through exactly the same test. It doesn't apply it properly, because somewhere in its being it feels that there's a freedom of expression interest on the other side, but it has not developed a proper jurisprudential approach to that, which in my mind would have to say, now we're having an internal argument, internal, two perspectives on freedom of expression. We can't just walk through this same three-part test thing anymore, because the three-part test properly creates an unlevel playing field. And so I really think that I don't have a, I mean, I've tried to think of what the analytical framework could be, and I don't have one, because the variety of interests are so broad, and often you have a collective free speech interest, you know, the right of the listener to receive information versus, or whatever it is, but something has to, you know, I think the courts have to move forward on that, and where we are now is not a good place on that.
Okay, so you're saying that the balancing rights approach cannot be applied when we're dealing with the same right.
No, what I'm saying is the free speech analysis under international law is not a balancing approach. It's we protect free speech and you have to justify your restriction. Go walk up a big hill. Go through I'm mixing my metaphors, but jump through a bunch of little hoops. If you can manage to jump through those hoops, we're going to accept your restriction. There is, I think, when you see conflicts between rights, like between free speech and privacy, then you get a little bit closer to it. But courts have always said, even in that case, you still have to justify the restriction, even though privacy is a right, but you still have to jump through the same three hoops, the three-part test, basically. But I don't think that works. Let's imagine a practical example. I bring a case claiming that my right as a consumer of news is threatened by the absence of strong anti-monopoly control over the media. So there's no law in my country that prevents monopoly control. This guy owns everything. my right to receive information is threatened. And then the court has got, the government's got to justify why it doesn't have an anti-monopoly law. Let's imagine another country where they have that law and the media owner brings the same case, saying this anti-monopoly law is restricting my free speech. Are the results going to be different? Is the test going to be different? It can't be. So I think, it's the balancing is not what normally happens. And even with privacy, that's not how the courts treat it. So I think that there needs to be another kind of test.
Okay, interesting. So some kind of new, really technical development within the jurisprudence, which I don't know. We'll check with our database whether any courts have ventured on that journey. May I open the conversation? Can you please introduce yourself?
My name is Yaman Akdeniz. I come from Turkey. I'm going to speak with my practitioner head rather than the academic head. I have been involved with pro bono legal support and strategic litigation in Turkey since 2009. The problem we have is, apart from an independent judiciary, cases take far too long. Some cases that we initiated back in 2009 and 2010, Sandra knows well because they provided us some funding, they still go through the courts. And the project that we started back in 2013, and cases go on forever. And I'm involved currently with 250 plus cases. 120 of these are involved with regards to internet blocking. The rest are criminal prosecutions, all political cases. But the problem is that a trial lasts almost 2 years in Turkey. The appeal process lasts another 3 years. When you reach the constitutional court level, you wait another 3 years. And then you take cases to the European Court of Human Rights. It takes another 4 years. So 12 to 13 years life cycle. If you're lucky, get priority treatment from the European Court, then I would say within 10 years. So redress mechanisms, especially with regards to freedom of expression cases in Europe, this is not a unique problem to Turkey, but Andrey would say probably for Russia and some other countries as well, is hugely problematic. And by the time they decided, that decision has no meaningful effect in terms of establishing norms because the cases are too old. Wikipedia has been blocked in Turkey for over a year now. We're going to ask priority treatment from the European Court of Human Rights next month, but because the Constitutional Court is not deciding. But by the time the European Court decides, it will be another 3 years. So,
but just talking about strategic litigation, isn't there? Because I know the European Court at the moment has thousands of cases from Turkey, but maybe 16,000, some incredible number. And we understand the context that prompted many litigators to go to the European system. On the other hand, if we're talking about being strategic here, bombarding our regional court with 16,000 cases, it's ensuring that it's going to fail, really. So isn't there, if we want to really ensure that the courts do play the role that they could play, isn't there some more strategic thinking that should occur before the cases are brought to the court?
If there was a court in Mars, we would go, but there isn't much of an alternative to go at the moment, and that's why the European Court was bombarded. But majority of those 60,000 applications were rejected by the court because they said you have to apply to a commission which was set up last year with regards to state of emergency measures. But that is taking time. Then there's, I mean, people have lost their jobs, and now as we speak, the Cumhuriyet trial ended, and almost all the journalists received terror-related convictions. So, and the European Court has given priority, but they haven't decided before the trial ended. So there are other issues as well, political issues.
Okay. Thank you, Yaman.
Well, my name is Dimas Kiprono. I work for Article 19 Eastern Africa. So I'm going to give an Eastern African perspective, but I'm going to zero in on Kenya. So within the last 18 months, we've had 3 far-reaching decisions on freedom of expression. The first one was the one that struck down criminal defamation. This case was highly inspired by an African court decision, the Konate case. And in Kenya, the Kenyan constitution recognizes international norms and international instruments as part of Kenyan law. So with that, there was another case that struck down a law that established a crime called undermining authority of a public officer. So basically, as it were, if you said something wrong about the president or any public officer, you could find yourself in jail for up to 7 years. And basically, the courts found that the provision does not make any sense, since citizens should be able to interrogate, to criticize what the government is doing. And the third one was a case that targeted bloggers and journalists especially. It was under our National Communications Act that established a crime called misuse of a licensed telecommunication device. And the case came up when a human rights defender wrote something on Facebook about a dude who works for an NGO and who was taking advantage of girls in exchange for scholarships. And so this individual was taken, charges were brought against him. And the wording of this provision included such things as causing undue anxiety. And so when the judges looked at this case, they found that it was vague and therefore could not stand the 3-part test. So all in all, we've seen that international norms and have really inspired judicial decisions from Kenya. And this is also cascading into other countries such as Zimbabwe. And so I support that judiciaries are very important.
Thank you, Demas. And that also is one of our findings at Columbia Global Freedom of Expression. But I think it's important to hear how courts and global norms do impact progressively and positively on freedom of expression, because we can be tempted to see everything quite in a dark fashion. Isaf want to speak? Oh yeah, so maybe I'm going to take 3 speakers, one after the other. Isaf, and then who do I have? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Isaf from Tunisia. I'm a human rights officer. I would like to, I have a remark for Mr. Toby Mendel and another one for Mr. Lanza on the issue of safety of a journalist and to end impunity in crimes committed against a journalist. So, Mr. Toby Mendel, you mentioned the great step that had been achieved in issuing or adopting the UN plan on the safety of a journalist. And you mentioned that the most important thing that to establish national mechanism that would be working on the protection of a journalist and handling maybe allegations that are allegation of violation of the safety of a journalist. Do you mean public national mechanism? Or do you mean those mechanisms or initiatives of monitoring, of protection that can be established among the civil society, for example. And here I would like to share with you, you mentioned that there is two status. I would like to have more clear info on this mechanism, and I would like to share with you an experience in Tunisia, a recent one, a national mechanism, but not a public one. It's an initiative of the syndicate, National Syndicate of Journalists, to establish a unit of monitoring of the safety of journalists, and also to provide the legal assistance for the journalist victims of violation. This unit is established with the support of UNESCO and OSCE, and it will be issuing their first report after tomorrow, on the 27th of April, and they have developed they developed indicators on the national indicator of the safety and national indicator of impunity also. And my second point is for Mr. Lanza. I would like to re-express here publicly for you all the gratitude of OSCE Tunisia for your participation and for your contribution to the celebration of the International Day on Ending Impunity in Crimes Committed Against Journalists in 2017. That was on the 16th of November. At that time, when I say we, that means the civil society in Tunisia, journalists in Tunisia, but also the office, the UNESCO, we were in need of a support from an international mechanism to show that there is mechanisms who are working on the protection of journalists, and to push also the society and the officials who were there to go forward for the protection of journalists. We reached you. You were available, and you supported the event with your recorded message, and we are very grateful for you. So thank you very much.
Talek?
Tarla McGonigal from the University of Amsterdam. Thank you, panelists, for your lightning interventions and some very enlightening information and details. I'd like to chip into the discussion, please, on the theme of safety by giving a reference to a European development this time. In 2016, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe adopted a recommendation which was addressed to the organization's 47 member states. Its focus was on the protection of journalism and the safety of journalists and other media actors. So the first prong, the protection of journalism, covers all the activities involved in journalism, so the pre-publication activities such as news gathering, substantive protection for content, editorial freedom, and also protection for the dissemination of the publication. The second prong tries to ensure that there would be protection not only for professional journalists, but also for the growing range of other contributors to public debate. So that's perhaps of at least symbolic significance in itself. What the recommendation tried to do was to take the expansive body of case law of the European Court of Human Rights dealing with both prongs to the recommendation and bring it together, organize it, and operationalize it. So it's all very well having these principles, but what is still required in order to implement them effectively? And one novel feature of that recommendation is a call on member states to set up or enable independent reviews of national laws, including draft laws, case law, policy, and practice to ensure compliance with Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So, whereas Toby referred to some promising initiatives that have yet to bear fruition, this is something that has borne fruit, but the fruit needs to be plucked. This recommendation is calling out for political traction. Member states of the Council of Europe need to get on board and actually implement it. The Council of Europe itself is busy devising an implementation strategy, and there are 1 or 2 initiatives going on at national level to try and generate this traction that it needs to get off the ground. So I just wanted to put that on people's radar screens, and if anybody's interested in more information, I'd be happy to provide that later. Thank you.
Thank you. I think behind you, I can't see much. Yeah.
It's Monroe.
Monroe.
So I was reflecting on the panel as a whole and wondering whether there's something that we might call the era of free expression, which has a beginning, an arc, and an end. And the question would be, how geopolitically does that arc get drawn? Does it work this way or does it work that way, et cetera? And how does it relate to the function of this, the way the panel sees the world and the way that the global project at Columbia sees the world? So it seems to me there is this effort to influence the arc. That is to say, we're all part of influencing the arc. Foundations are part of influencing the arc. The press establishment is influencing the arc. But so are other governments, other forces in the society. So it's really a question of how we see that arc.
Right. Well, we'll have maybe final thought to all of you. Some more reactions from the participants. Guy.
Hi, Guilherme Canela from UNESCO. Just trying to talk about another challenge and then thanking for your comments on that. We always had a relationship, more problematic or less problematic, between freedom of expression and elections. So during elections time, we face in many countries of this planet more violence against journalists, but we also can talk about media concentration and its effects on elections, or freedom of information requests about elections. But now with this entire story on the so-called fake news or false news, we are experiencing a lot of troubles related to elections. And I'm particularly concerned in the role of the judges on that. In many countries, we have special courts for elections called electoral justice. And we are witnessing a very complex way of the judges are dealing with this phenomena. And the political parties in some countries are trying to extend the competition during the election period through the courts. And this can be a risk to democracy, although we need to deal with the problem of freedom of expression. So I think we do have a challenge here in also assessing better the relationship between elections and freedom of expression in all these new phenomena you were mentioning earlier in the panel.
Thank you, Guy. Is there anyone among the panelists who wants to react to some of the comments that you've just heard? Toby, there was one question to you, but I think there were some challenging questions that, okay, first Toby and then we'll...
Well, on this specific question, I think it's, first of all, a very good question. You know, I mean, I think a lot of different mechanisms can be useful. So another country that I'm working on the safety issue is Pakistan. They have 6 civil society-based or non-government-based mechanisms doing different things, and some quite interesting things. For example, one of them is a group of, the editors-based mechanism, and they simply coordinate so that when an attack occurs, they're all reporting reliably and more or less on the same facts about the attack, so that it helps build, and they make sure they report on it, so it builds the case and emphasizes the thing. But I think that ultimately there are limits to how far a civil society-based mechanism can go. For example, on the impunity side, I mean, civil society cannot really investigate. I mean, they can try to collect some evidence, but they're not professionals with that. They don't have the legal powers, and they don't also have the knowledge. It's a very scientific, and we need the police to do that, basically, or at least properly trained people. They certainly can't bring a case, and they certainly can't decide a case. So I mean, I think there are limits in Pakistan where they have this thing still an important thrust of the movement for safety is to get an official mechanism. So what I guess I would say is, it's great to have civil society mechanisms. It's not always easy to get an official mechanism, and not every country has the level of problem that it needs an official mechanism. I'm not saying that every country needs one of these things. I mean, I don't know exactly where Tunisia is at the moment on that. That was closer to the situation there. So I think that it's, different strokes for different folks, but if you have a serious problem, I think that ultimately you should be aiming for an official mechanism. Just to mention a little bit on the two sides, what you also asked, I mean, the protection side is about when somebody's at risk, they might have received some threats, or when they raise any credible evidence about being at risk, we want to protect them before they become a casualty, and we're on to the impunity side of things. We want to stop these things. The Colombian mechanism, which is a huge and very well-funded mechanism, it's entirely focusing on that side. So, ultimately, some cases you can get an armored vehicle, you can get protection, you can get whatever. But obviously on the impunity side, I mean, 9 out of 10 of these cases are never, globally, are never brought to trial. Now, in a lot of countries, lots of cases don't go to trial because the police are not that efficient. And these are sophisticated cases. In most cases, they're sophisticated criminals specifically targeting somebody with a high, they're not just sort of ordinary criminals trying to steal some money that they might do stupidly so they get caught more easily. They're prosecuting these crimes effectively, let's say, most of the time. So, but in response to that, and because of the seriousness of these crimes for the whole of society, censorship by killing is a term that the special rapporteurs have used in this context. You need a higher level, so you need more police resources. You need better trained police. You need to really make sure that impunity in these crimes is not that great. If I may say something as well about Guilherme's, I mean, I think that this is a really, really important issue, and not just the judicial relationship, but the whole space. Essentially, if we look at the traditional tools that democracies have used to, help create a level playing field during elections, they are things like around spending and around balance and impartiality in the broadcast media. Those are the two main tools that democracies use. With the space that we're going, sort of decline in traditional media influence, the ways of getting around and using relatively small amounts of money to have huge impacts, using Cambridge Analytica and other clever tools. So both of those tools are essentially breaking down, and I think we really need to revisit the whole thing. And not to be propagandist, but my organization is sponsoring a panel discussion at RightsCon in Toronto, to which I'm sure many of you are going. Edison will be on our panel as well, where we're going to be discussing that issue. I think we really need to start thinking a little bit outside the box on that.
Okay. Rebecca?
Yeah,
the mic.
I think the whole idea of independent review of laws, I keep hearing about this more and more discussion of the need both for independent review and sort of impact assessment of a proposed law or existing law on different rights, both within a jurisdiction and also globally. So there have been a number of cases where I've seen people calling, we already have companies doing human rights impact assessments on how particular policies or practices will affect their users globally in different ways. I actually wrote something with UNESCO a few years ago where one of our recommendations was that national laws that affect online speech should be subject to a human rights impact assessment that looks at the global implications for freedom of expression of that law, not just within its own borders, and that a country that's actually committed to global freedom of expression, not just within its borders, has an obligation to do this. One quick thing about Monroe's comment about the arc of history. I'm violently against historical determinism, and I kind of feel one of the reasons why we are where we are today is that there have been too many assumptions made that the arc of history and technology is ultimately towards freedom. And then everybody just kind of expected that technology would automatically take us to more freedom of expression, just kind of automatically, and now here we are. So I think that there isn't a predetermined arc. and that assumptions about predetermined arcs are going to take us to very dark places where people don't take responsibility for their own actions, and we all have to build the direction of history directly ourselves and make no assumptions about where it's going. We'll live to regret it.
I promised myself I wouldn't be cynical the second time I spoke, but I'm going to break that promise. Because literally everything I have heard on this panel, all I'm thinking is, oh my God, it's so much worse with machine learning. It's so much worse with machine learning. So right from safety of journalists, we have facial recognition software that changes our perception of public space. Usually public space, you are guaranteed anonymity. It allowed you to do things in the public space. With facial recognition, that changes. We alter how we behave. And if you look at how machine learning systems work, it's actually worse for the minority than it is for the majority. Because when machine learning systems are trained, for example, they have, it's been proven that they have more, less dark-skinned people in that database. So now that database is worse at accurately determining who the dark-skinned people are, which means that they then, end up arresting more people. And it's kind of this horrible circle where our reality, which isn't perfect, is feeding something that doesn't understand context. And I just wanted to leave you all with that depressing thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Just maybe, I do wonder whether we're not going from one extreme to another in our assessment of technology, a bit like a pendulum. And right now, it seems like the pendulum is all on the very dark side of things. 5-6 years ago, we were all singing the benefits of technology, and hopefully we may reach a more balanced perspective. I'm just maybe putting that on the table, and also wondering aloud, listening to you, whether the actors that are driving the new information ecosystem are quite baby actors in many ways. And don't they need a bit more time to learn to become, actors within the global system? If you think of the nation state, which has several centuries of history, and they are not all acting very well, most of them, but I don't know whether even democratic institutions are much older. Aren't we, we should push them to grow very quickly, but even there, a bit of that as well to take into account. The fact that they are reasonably new actors in the information system.
I can respond very quickly to that. I think there's this romanticism of innovation. I think maybe you were talking about 5 years ago. I'm not sure what was happening in this circle then. But when we romanticize innovation, what happens is that we push towards progress. Like Rebecca said, we just assume that technology would mean ABC, but we realize that it doesn't mean any of that. The problem with the way that actors, as you term them, baby actors, and the way that they're functioning now, is that they're not, they have a real impact on everyday life that is often irreversible as well. And they for example, I can be upset if Facebook took down a post, but I don't know what to be upset about what I'm not seeing, right? So they influence what I see, but also what I don't see. And if they have such a, visceral impact on everyday life, then we have to hold them to the standard that they actually exercise. I don't think that the reasoning of them being new to the ecosystem should be used, because the impact that they have is not new. It's pervasive, and it's dangerous, and it's irreversible as well. Again, negative, but...
Jameel?
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that and to state the obvious, I mean, they are baby actors in the sense of seeming to be considering for the first time the implications of the power that they have. But they have immense power, right? If Facebook wanted to decide an election tomorrow or in 2 years, it could decide the election. And, just by making tweaks to its algorithms, you know, that privilege one political party over another or one set of political views over another. You know, I think it would be relatively straightforward for Facebook to do something like that. And, you know, we've seen the power that Facebook has in places like Myanmar, where Facebook is, you know, effectively the only source of information. And so, yes, you know, it's dangerous to act quickly when the technology is changing so, you know, so quickly. But it's also very dangerous not to act. And you know, that's what makes these questions so, you know, so difficult, is that we have very limited information, in part because the social media companies are opaque, but in part because they haven't been around for very long, and at least in the form that they now take. And yet we have to figure out how to, you know, how to act very quickly to avoid the kinds of, you know, really substantial and irreversible harms that could result if we didn't act.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, so looking ahead, could each one of you give us a positive milestone looking ahead? Within the next 12 months, what is it that you think could happen? Whether it's a court decision or, I don't know, something else, a policy decision, a law. Is there anything that we can hold on to? We've actually heard quite a few positive things. I just want to try to balance a little bit the very dark perspective that, you know, that we may be tempted to fall for, and particularly from some of the countries that we've heard from. There may be different standpoints in terms of assessing the state of freedom of expression and the actors and what technology has brought to some places. So just inviting you to reflect maybe more, if there is a way to reflect more positively, or to look at some of the moments coming up that may be a hook for further engagement, for greater protection, for actions.
Well, I started out my comments saying I may have misunderstood your instructions on your email, but on this one I'm pretty sure I understood it, and you said, what is some advice to resist and move forward? So instead of something positive, and I think I've been fairly positive too so far, so I'm going to talk about resisting and how we can move forward. You know, people have used to say anyway that you know, the internet, the digital revolution is like the printing press, and I mean, looking at it very much from an informational and communication point of view. And I think that, you know, it's easy to get misled into that because it is communications driven, but I actually think it's much more like the Industrial Revolution in the sense that it's fundamentally, you know, altering our entire social and economic and you know, interactive framework, much beyond. I mean, a lot of it's communication based, but it's much more than that. You know, the taxi guy that drove me in yesterday was worried about self-driven cars. I mean, if we look at what happened during the Industrial Revolution, and I mean, you know, you said we have to move quickly. This thing is happening in a massively reverse telescope time frame. But in the Industrial Revolution, over a long period of time, we completely revised our whole legal framework. Mm-hmm. You know, we basically developed tort law. We developed, Anil this morning said we should spend some money to, you know, the government should be spending money to address the problems. You know, we developed the social welfare state, okay, which basically was a response to industrial. I mean, we completely, you know, sort of the before and after, which was over a long period of time, so it didn't look like a before and after, but, you know, and I think that, you know, when we talk about, oh, should we regulate or not, or should we this, should we that, I mean, you know, these are not the, you know, and somebody this morning sort of mentioned Marxism, I mean, without being a supporter of Marxism, the theory of Marxism and that political thing drove Western states, you know, to reevaluate in more radical ways, probably. I mean, I'm not a historian, but then they would have otherwise. And I think we need to, and I don't have the answers, you know, but we need to really be thinking outside the box. I think we need to be thinking of this as a completely transformative moment for our world, and that, you know, sort of, are we going to regulate or not? You know, definitely. I mean, I'm with Anna. Absolutely, we're going to regulate, but we need to think what or whatever. We need to spend money. We need to do a lot of things, big things. And not just, you know, oh, let's, you know, give a little bit of development money to alternative news or something like that. We've got to really have big solutions to this problem. It's not a small thing. Okay, thank you. Andrey, a big solution or?
Well, I don't think that anybody has a big solution here or anywhere else. I have little hope, and that little hope is, I mean, I already mentioned the, in the field that I was talking about, the disinformation regulation. I already mentioned the European Parliament resolution of 2016. As a result of the activities of the Parliament, the European Commission established a high-level group that discussed the issue of fake news and disinformation for 3 months or so, and it came with a bit naive, but still quite interesting report about a month ago or 2 months ago. This month, the European Commission is to publish a communique, well, reportedly, maybe it will happen next month. And so my little hope, which is based both on the parliamentary decision and on the high-level working group conclusions, is that the activities and the solutions and the regulation that will be suggested by the European Union will be very much putting us back, if not into the box which Toby was mentioning, but rather on the foundations of free expression and freedom of the media. Making focus, I guess, on media literacy and media research.
Okay, Edison.
Yes, thank you for this challenges discussion, but I think that this is not an animal that we have to eat in a one bocado in Spanish. And I think that it's very important the role of the international bodies to, you know, acknowledge and take this discussion. In the Special Rapporteur Freedom of Expression, we propose some states in the Organization of American States to open a space to reflect with the impact of the digital age in freedom of expression in the electoral period that Guilherme proposed here, because I think that this process, this revolution, we need to take in part what is the impact in privacy, what is the impact in freedom of expression, what is the impact in the electoral process, because other things is out of our mandate, like the economic impacts and so on. And then I think that the expert acknowledge that we have in the international law and the international experts, it's important. In the last years, with the Special Rapporteur, we released a joint declaration about fake news and freedom of expression and the impact on fake news. And I feel a year after the decision that that decision it's a good approach with the problem. In fact, in the place with the situation it's taking in present in the best way, take this kind of recommendation, and well, we need to talk about that in next joint declaration and forum like this, another space, because other problem of this area is which is the place to regulate these issues, right? Because you know the picture today that you show. Facebook is a global forum with 2 billion of people, cross borders and so on. And finally, the regulation in each country, in one country, it's not enough to abort these new challenges.
Thank you. Jameel, you want to
say something positive?
A positive thought or an advice?
Yeah, so I did not mean to be so negative. I think of all this technology as always two-sided. It's like discovering fire. You can use it to cook your dinner, or you can use it to burn your house down. And we should figure out how to use it to cook our dinners. But I want to point to one specific positive development. Public officials, I mentioned this earlier, but public officials are increasingly using social media as a way of communicating with their constituents. And I think that's a very, very good thing. I think that's a great development because it opens up the possibility of conversations that couldn't possibly have taken place without this technology. Now you can engage in a virtual town hall with your elected representative and not just have your views heard by that representative, even if you're hundreds of miles away from that person, but communicate with other constituents about the policies and statements of that elected representative. And these public forums that have been created through social media, I think, are playing an increasingly significant role in our democracies. My institute has this case challenging President Trump's practice of blocking critics on his Twitter account. And that's one of several suits that are in the courts, in the American courts right now. I think there are a couple in Canada too now, in which litigants are asking the courts to recognize these forums as public forums within, at least in the United States, within the meaning of the First Amendment. I think those are significant cases. But even apart from those cases, the practice of public officials communicating with their constituents in this way, I think, is an important development that we should celebrate.
Thank you.
I think one positive development that is beginning to take shape and I think has great potential going forward is when we build technology keeping human rights or keeping certain values at the center of it. So the problem up until now has been that engineers have always said, I don't understand what you mean by fairness. Like, what do you mean by fairness? Can you tell me when I'm sitting down to write code, what do I mean? I think that is slowly changing because we're building legal and policy advice in technical terms, and we're explaining technology in legal terms. I think that's a very strong development, and if it carries on, I think it actually has the potential to build bridges and make sure that the worst case scenario doesn't happen. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, this is about power, right? Mm-hmm. And it's about who has the ability to exercise power over what people can say, both within and across borders, and what they can do, and how our information ecosystem is shaped. And how do you hold power accountable? That's what governance is about. And to quote something that was said many years ago by Rosenthal Alves, who some people here know, who's a professor of journalism at University of Texas, Austin. Before the internet, the global information ecosystem was a desert. It was based on scarcity and the allocation of scarce resources and the governance of scarce speech, right? And our entire political economy was based on that. And now it's a rainforest. Right, there's completely different organisms in the way in which you govern a society based on scarcity, and the way you govern an ecosystem that's based on insane overabundance and excess, and many monsters running around eating each other is very different. And so just to speak to Toby's point, we need governance innovation. Our governance structures are not fit for purpose. They're pre-internet age, certainly pre-AI, artificial intelligence governance structures. They don't work across borders well. They don't hold power accountable within borders well. And we need massive innovation on the scale that we saw innovation to meet the technical change, technological evolution of the Industrial Revolution, and it's only just begun. And so I guess my optimistic point is, as a daughter of a historian, is that once upon a time, the world was full of states run by, whose only governance model was the divine right of kings, right? And humanity has managed to evolve in terms of thinking about how power is given legitimacy and who gets the power and who confers it on whom, how it's constrained. And so on. And, we evolved again with the Industrial Revolution, and we can evolve again, but it's going to require we've got a long way to go, and it's going to be painful. And the other optimistic thing is that there's a movement building that's really committed, but this is going to take several generations.
Can I just respond very quickly? Sure. I mean, one of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution was a massive growth in government.
Yeah.
Government was small, and then government was big. And I think you're Bill, just riffing off your points. I mean, what we really need is a massive growth in international governance. Now, I'm with you. You said this morning, you don't want the UN. I don't want that either. So we need a different. I mean, I don't know whether it's reformable, but I mean, we do need something at that level. So maybe, now we need, and I agree that it's going to be painful.
Maybe it's many things.
But I mean, that could be part of the thing, some massive growth in some new form of international.
Thank you very much. Well, given the state of leadership within the United Nations, which is the only governance body, global governance body at our disposal right now, I am a little bit less optimistic now than I was earlier.
We can build a new one. We don't have to just sit with the UN.
I completely agree with you. I was going to just put some personal thought here. Notwithstanding maybe the schizophrenic image that is emerging out of the discussion, because I still want to highlight the fact that we had some very positive stories that were brought forward in terms of very positive changes in a number of countries, and the role of courts as remaining quite an important old institution that protect our rights. So there are still old institutions that are still able to be adapted and that are adaptable to this new environment somehow and somewhat. So let's not forget that side of the panel today, and the fact that we've seen also progressive development in terms of the protection of journalists and the fight against impunity at national level through international weaving of global norms. Notwithstanding all of that, it was an interesting conversation, which didn't go at all where I thought it will go somehow, but that's very interesting. So we are ending up with a rather not the arc of history, but a big question mark as far as history is concerned and where we're going at the moment. But there is a strong feeling from at least three of the panelists, no, four in fact, of the panelists, that we are at a transformative moment, that we are living through a revolution of some kind, which is going possibly much faster than the previous industrial revolution, at a pace at least much faster, but whose impact will probably be as far-reaching in terms of life of individuals, in terms of the legal system, governance, governments, humans, and so on and so forth. I think one of the word that has not been mentioned, but which I guess could be a driver for the years ahead, is leadership. To what extent do we have a leadership that is enlightened enough and visionary enough to understand that what we're going through demand big questions and big answers and courageous answers, one. The second thing that has not been mentioned is China and is Russia and the notion of a very old notion of internet sovereignty that is also looming as large possibly as if it happened, I mean, you know, not that I'm questioning all of the data regarding Facebook, but some of them I am questioning. I don't think, but that's not the purpose of the, you know, so we also have, in addition to the trend related to the social media and their power and what they may or may not do in some of the more fragile democracy, we also have this conflict looming large right now and the reconstruction of the global order using some very old concept, not at all revolutionary, being brought into the new revolution. So this makes for, I think, a particularly complex moment that we are living in. I was not expecting us to come with a solution at all, but I think to pose the issue, to pose the problem in those terms, may allow us to, you know, to think a little bit outside the box and to think beyond the immediate moment, which, you know, is very, of course, very present as it is a moment, but to look forward maybe to those big questions and try to think of the current moment as a way to move us closer to answering the big question. So I'm going to leave it at that and invite you to have a coffee and I don't know where coffee is, but yeah, it's over there. And to thank the panel very much. And I have realized that I never introduced any of you properly. So please, my apologies to you because I didn't introduce them, but their bio is on the website and may I invite you to look at them. Thank you so much. Thank you.